ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music, and more.
Hey folks, I know you're here for News Daily, but I'm Erin Park and I thought you might be interested in my new podcast, Expanse, Nowhere Man. It's about how in 1999 a young American wandered into one of Australia's deadliest landscapes, alone and on purpose, triggering a media storm and one of the biggest searches Australia had ever seen. Spanning 3 decades and 2 continents, this story has taken me places I never imagined. Stick around at the end of this episode to hear a taste.
One of Iran's closest allies is Russia. So, why did Vladimir Putin decide not to come to Tehran's aid and provide military support as Israel, and then America, worked to destroy its nuclear program? Today, Middle East expert Anna Borshchevskaya from the Washington Institute on what the war means for Moscow and whether Putin might help Iran now to rebuild its nuclear capability. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Anna, it's been an incredible few weeks with Donald Trump, of course, always there. His latest spray at Israel and Iran was, well, quite something.
Yes, it was. It's definitely a change from what we're used to hearing from American presidents.
You know what? We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the they're doing. Do you understand that?
Yes, that's right. All right. Well, the ceasefire, of course, is in place, although everything can change very quickly. And we have these reports of preliminary classified findings out of the US that the Iranian nuclear program has been set back only by a few months. And I want to talk to you about that in just a moment. But, of course, we're here to talk about Russia because that is your expertise. When Israel first began its strikes on Iran, there was immediate concern, of course, that there could be a major escalation. And I think it's fair to say that many people's minds drifted to what Russia might do.
Yes, there were very good reasons to think about what Russia might do because in the last several years, but really under all of Putin's presidency, Russia had moved closer to Iran. Putin, by and large, attempted to play this balancing act across the Middle East of building good ties with everyone in the region, including, of course, Israel. But in reality, he empowered Iran and its proxies along with, until last December, the Assad regime in Syria. In other words, Putin, on the one hand, tried to play this balancing act of being able to have good relations with everyone, but in reality, he was closer with anti-American forces in the region.
And important to remember as we discuss this is that Russia is a nuclear state, of course.
Of course, yeah, absolutely. It sure is. And Putin never fails to remind us that Russia is a nuclear state. The Kremlin regularly engages in nuclear saber-rattling to scare the West into concessions on Ukraine, most recently, but also on other issues.
All right. Well, I know Russia didn't come, of course, to Iran's aid during this conflict, unlike North Korea has done for Vladimir Putin in the war in Ukraine, and, of course, as Iran has done by providing short-range missiles and drones to Russia. So we're going to come to why that is in a moment. But it's really good just to step back and understand the history of this relationship between Iran and Russia, because they have a really complicated past, don't they?
Absolutely. They do have a very complicated past. It is a history that spans over 500 years, most of it colored by distrust. Historically, it is Iran, remember, that lost wars to Russia, not the other way around. The fact of the matter is, probably as early as the 1980s or the late 1980s, the Soviet Union and Iran did begin to take steps towards improving relations. And those efforts continued in the 1990s. it was Russia that began constructing Iran's nuclear facilities, nuclear program, the Bushehr reactor. Again, as I said earlier, Putin wanted to build good ties with all actors in the Middle East, but he did lean closer to anti-American forces. And it was Syria that really brought the Russia-Iran relationship to unprecedented heights. Remember, Russia intervened militarily in Syria in late 2015. And of course, in January of this year, the two countries, Russia and Iran, that is, signed a strategic partnership agreement. So Russia and Iran continued getting closer and closer, which brings us to the present moment. And as you said, Russia did not come to Iran's rescue.
Yeah, absolutely. So the war in Ukraine has provided a strategic reason for Russia and Iran to work more closely together.
That's right. The war in Ukraine certainly provided more reasons for Russia and Iran to work more closely together. Russia found itself isolated by the West, as did Iran. But also, even before the invasion of Ukraine, these countries shared a larger geostrategic vision for the world. In other words, they both resented American leadership. They wanted to see a different world order, and they wanted to see what they often call a quote-unquote multipolar world. And certainly they wanted to reduce American influence, specifically in the Middle East.
All right, well, Anna, given this closer alliance that we've discussed, let's look at what role Russia could have played in this war when Israel began its strikes on Iran. Vladimir Putin thought initially he could be a peacemaker. Tell me about that.
Yeah, again, this is Putin's favorite role to play in the Middle East. And this goes back to what I said earlier. If you see how he tried to position himself as somebody that can talk to all sides, typically conflicting sides in the Middle East, who has good relations with everyone, you can see why somebody in that position would want to cast themselves as a mediator. But it's a way for Putin to position Russia as an indispensable actor, somebody without whom you cannot solve major world events.
Russian President Vladimir Putin held a 50-minute phone call with the US President Donald Trump, the Kremlin condemning Israel's attacks, both sides saying it's not too late for Iran to strike a deal.
As you know, Vladimir called me up. He said, "Can I help you with Iran?" I said, "No, I don't need help with Iran. I need help with you."
If the West and if Israel and Iran, along with Europe and the US, were to accept Russia as a mediator, it would take Russia out of this perceived pariah status in the West, and again would cast Russia as important.
So he wanted to be a peacemaker, which of course did not happen. But given this relationship with Iran, why didn't Putin render any sort of assistance whatsoever to the regime?
Well, I think there's several reasons. And one thing I said very early on, if you read the strategic partnership agreement between Russia and Iran that I mentioned earlier, that the two countries signed in January, it doesn't actually obligate Russia to come to Iran's aid. There is no clause that obligates them to come to defense of each other. It's not like the NATO charter, but also Russia would expect a country to formally ask for assistance. This is a very different view of what a strategic partnership is. It's a far more limited view. And I think also, certainly given how bogged down Putin is in Ukraine, he had little to spare. He frankly would have, I think in the beginning of this conflict, probably expected it to end fairly quickly. His biggest concern would be Iran turning pro-Western, but if there were limited strikes against Iran that weakened the regime a little bit, that would not have gone contrary to his interest, because he sees Russia at the top of a power pyramid, and he wants Russia to be powerful than others. That is how he sees all relationships. Lastly, we saw some very interesting thing going on with oil prices. There was a spike very quickly in oil prices, but then it went down. But certainly the potential for oil prices rising also would have very much benefited Putin's war effort in Ukraine, because that is one important way that how he's able to fund his war. I do think, though, I will say this, Iran turning pro-Western is a big concern for Russia. And that is why I did wonder if potentially if things were to change, again, the situation has been moving very quickly, if Russia could do maybe a little bit more to help Iran. But also, given Russia's ties with all other actors in the region, with the Gulf states and with Israel, Putin wanted to take a very cautious approach here.
But what you're saying is if Vladimir Putin sensed perhaps that the Iranian regime was about to fall, that perhaps he would change his decision on this and render support.
Yeah, it is something that I wondered. But, there's several questions to ask here also. What could realistically Russia offer? And two, with the United States entering the conflict, that's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's then, Anna, unpack what the consequences of this Israel-Iran conflict could be for Russia and what sort of relationship it might now have with Iran. There are negatives in all of this, aren't there, for Vladimir Putin, not least of which it has exposed Moscow's limitations and the fact that it's not a particularly reliable ally.
Yeah, absolutely. If there is no regime collapse in Iran, certainly it's hard to see how this regime comes out strong. In other words, we're going to more likely see a significantly weakened regime in Tehran. And that does hurt Russia's overall strategic position in this region, because Putin did position himself as somebody who supported these forces. And again, Putin doesn't understand the term ally the same way as we do, but the fact that he did not come to Iran's rescue does quite a bit of damage to Russia's reputation as a reliable partner. But it does hurt Russia's strategic position in the region. I would say far more so, than the fall of the Assad regime in last December.
Yeah, on the flip side, of course, of this, as you've mentioned, there are some positives for Russia because attention has well and truly drifted away from his own conflict, Vladimir Putin's conflict in Ukraine, which has really intensified over the last few weeks.
That's absolutely right. And especially it intensified specifically on June 13, when Israel began its campaign against the Iranian nuclear facilities. World distraction from Ukraine is absolutely still very much a benefit to Russia, and that is a chief priority for Putin.
And what about the fact that Israel and the US acted alone? They did not go through the normal international diplomatic channels, if you like. Will Russia exploit that?
Well, they've already begun exploiting that. There was no shortage of rhetoric coming out condemning the perceived unilateralism and perceived American cynicism and hypocrisy of America as a hypocrite country, as America supposedly preaching about liberal values but breaking them. And certainly, I think we can expect the Kremlin to continue to attempt to capitalize on theme with countries outside the liberal free world.
So, Anna, what now for this relationship? As we said, the latest, and they are preliminary findings from US intelligence, suggests that Iran's nuclear program has only been set back by a few months. Could Russia now help Iran on that front, help to rebuild its capacity, do you think?
I wouldn't rule it out. Remember again that Russia did build the Borshchevskaya reactor in Iran in the first place. Russia was a key supporter of the Iranian nuclear program, and they were champions of claiming that the Iranian nuclear program is peaceful. Provision of high technology goods such as nuclear reactors is Russia's competitive advantage. So I think, again, the story is not over and Russia's relationship with Tehran is not broken.
So how interested then is Russia in keeping this really quite tight alliance continuing on?
I think they would want to continue this alliance because, again, Russia has empowered Iran and its proxies across the region with the aim of weakening American influence in this region. So if that regime collapses, that is a far bigger concern for them than Iran turning nuclear. Historically, Russia simply never worried about the Iranian nuclear program the same way that the West or Israel did. But they did worry about Iran turning pro-Western. And historically, they had good reasons to do so, because remember that prior to the 1979 revolution, Iran was pro-Western. And Russians do understand history, so they also know that the Iranian people are far more pro-Western than the Iranian regime. Iran turning pro-Western would be a big strategic loss for Russia.
Anna Borshchevskaya is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute, an American think tank. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. ABC News Daily will be back again tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
Soaring temperatures, a lack of water, and sand dunes every 500 metres. It's one of the most inhospitable places on Earth.
It's August 1999. And something strange is happening in the Australian outback.
When I got there, it was just organised chaos.
It's one of the most extensive searches ever mounted in the Great Sandy Desert.
A well-to-do young American has dumped his belongings and walked out into the Great Sandy Desert.
A white guy from America, what hope has he got? They'll be looking for a body.
He sent a postcard to his parents in America just saying, I'm heading into the desert. Goodbye.
Triggering a media sensation and one of the biggest searches Australia had ever seen.
Once the Americans arrived, it became a lot more bizarre.
We really need to be what we call semper gumby, always flexible.
He insisted that people use his radio handle, Gunslinger.
Are you taking the piss?
But there's one problem that no one's got an answer for. How do you search for someone who doesn't want to be found?
I felt it was his choice to choose not to come out of the desert. I knew he couldn't be content with living a life unless he did this.
My name is Erin Park, and I've been obsessed with this story for years. And I'm not the only one. Why would a fit, intelligent young man with everything to live for plunge into one of the deadliest landscapes in Australia on purpose?
It's very easy to dismiss it as crazy, but I think when you dive deeper into it, you see that it's not crazy.
It's a story spanning 3 decades, 2 continents, and some strange encounters. I really don't know how I started off in the desert in Northern Australia looking into this, and now I'm in bloody Alaska looking for a porcupine.
Every little thread was even more glittery and sparkly and fascinating and quirky.
And it polarised opinions the world over. Were his actions selfish or inspired?
The backlash was pretty fierce.
And it turns out this desert, where Robert Baguki went missing, is keeping other secrets. What Robert Baguki did here is just the tip of the iceberg.
We've got a lot of people missing. It remains a mystery, you know?
At a time when so many of us feel lost, what's the most extreme thing you do to feel found?
The idea of being out here alone scares the hell out of me. I ain't no Robert Baguki, that's for sure.
And at what cost?
Death will come, and I'll be ready for it.
This is Season 5 of Expanse, Nowhere Man. Find it on the ABC Listen app and all the usual places.